I'm super excited to be here with a title filled with words joy and terror. How can you not be? I'm also excited because I used to work with Dan nearly 30 years ago. Not dating us, we don't look a day over 35, but we worked together. And now I just learned today that Juan lives about 30 minutes up the road from me or across the street from me. So great to have you guys on board. I am really excited for what we have to cover today. So with that, just so everybody's aware, we do have some questions we've prepared in advance and we'll be walking through those. However, I'm sure you'll come up with questions as we go. So please feel free to use the chat, drop your questions in, and then, yeah, thanks, what you just said in chat. So once we get through the standard questions, I'm going to go to the chat and we'll start asking those questions as well. So with that, I'd love to have the panelists give just a short intro. And at that time, let us know, do you have any questions for the audience as we kick it off? Dan, why don't you take this one first?
I will have a question for the audience in a moment, but hi, Dan Wall. As Dave mentioned, I've known him for 30 plus years, Julia and Jeff for many years as well. I guess the highlight of what I'm doing is I've been doing software or software process improvement or software excellence work for over 40 years. So as a software engineer, I've written code, I've been a configuration manager, I've tested, I've been a project manager, I've been an executive. I've helped an organization of 5,000 go from CMM level 0 to level 3. Helped other small organizations from 5 or 6 people to do the same type of thing. Wide background inside of experience. I guess my biggest claim to fame, if any people have been here, is I helped make Guitar Hero and Tony Hawk and some cool video games, which was a lot of fun. And then I transitioned from more traditional stuff into the automotive arena about 15 years ago. And we use a model called Automotive SPICE, and I'm a principal assessor there. And so far, between ASPICE and CMMI, I've done a little over 500 assessments. But that's it. Juan, why don't you do it yourself, and then I have a good question for everyone on the call.
Okay. So I'll throw it back to you, Dan, when I'm done. So my name is Juan Webb. I started my career off in aerospace and defense, doing intelligence type devices and radar systems and embedded control systems for airplane engines, missiles, and drones. I was actually, and for me, it's kind of a strange story because I started off as being one of the problem children related to development. I'm the guy that didn't follow processes, that just like to go out and make things work. So where I am today, right, I deal with process improvement. I'm also, like Dan, a principal assessor, and I'm also a competent instructor for that model that Dan calls ASPICE. I also worked with the FAA as a DER, working with certification data and passing that off to them to approve. So, and have a lot of auditing and assessing experience and leading organizations in being helpful from where they are, their current state to an improved state of successful development. So I think for me, that's pretty much what I wanted to provide to you guys. So Dan, I know you had a question to kind of ask the audience, so I'm going to throw it back to you to ask that question.
Thanks, Juan. So everyone, I know you're muted, but I want you to think about this. What piece of technology do you own that's the most complex?
Are you going to give us the answer at the end?
I will. I think I will give you an answer, but it's be very interesting. I often ask this question and I get very interesting answers. Particularly most of the time when I'm working in the auto industry, most people, truthfully, hold up their phone.
Yep.
Yes.
Which is very interesting. However, think about your car, the vehicle that you're in. By far, it is the most complex piece of technology that you personally own or you interact with for the most part on every day. Modern cars today, depending upon The low end or the high end will have upwards of 200 ECUs, so 200 computers in the car that talk to each other. There is more than 100 million lines of code in a car. And depending upon, again, if you go to the higher end, it's closer to 200 million. Jeff, how many lines of code are in like a 787 Boeing?
Lots and
No.
lots, but I know that there's a lot in things that I work with, like F-35s and F-18s and lots of missiles on board. So yeah, they're all up there.
They're up there.
Hundreds
So
of thousands, millions, in fact.
yeah, the last I saw from the Boeing 777 only had in the neighborhood of about 12 million lines of code.
Yep.
So a car upwards of 150 to 200 million lines of code, and it's only going to get worse.
Yep.
Or
And that's
better,
still-
or depending upon how you think of it. Back in 1987, there was not any computers in the cars. And so as you could see over the course of the years, it's grown tremendously. So the complexity has gone up. The expectations of what a car can do and how the car works has increased exponentially. I often ask this question when I'm teaching classes or working with automotive executives. Said, are you a hardware company or are you a software company? And I see people, sort of hedging their bets on it. But what's really interesting is in the last probably 10 or 15 years, 80 to 90% of the innovation that's coming in cars is from the software and the systems aspect of this.
Yep.
So extremely complex, usable every day. And that leads us into our joys and our terrors, because you can imagine all the wonderful things that are out there. So that's my question for you. So back to you, Dave.
All right. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for not knowing the answer to how many lines of code are in a Boeing. I would have felt really bad about myself and most of us if you had the answer off the top of your head. And Dan, I also want to thank you for making a liar of me after I said you and I met when we were 5, and that was 30 years ago, to saying you had 40 years of experience. You blew it for both of us. Everyone knows we're older than 35.
Dave, I was working before you were. I remember when you got hired, so it's okay.
Wow. And that makes me a lot younger than both of you guys, actually, if
Oh,
that's when you've been working.
Yeah. Well, in my career, I did spend 10 years in automotive. And so I am very excited to jump into our first question that ties to your abstract. You mentioned the joys and terrors, which I'm sure those 2 words alone brought half the people here. So the joys and terrors of automotive engineering. I'd love to hear from each of you. Juan, maybe you take the lead. What does it mean?
I will. So our title really is about the joys and terror in automotive engineering. And so when we take a step back to really think about this, I want you guys to look at it from the perspective that in the automotive industry, right? You can look at it from multiple perspectives. From the perspective of the end user or the road user, the drivers or the buyers of the vehicles. From the OEMs, or what we call tier 1, which are like the major suppliers to the OEMs. You can also think about it from the engineers who actually work on those vehicles. So when we think about the joys and terrors, kind of related to the experiences that each one of those groups have. So consider, for example, if you're the OEM, right? Some of the things that brings happiness to you is basically your innovation, right? Creating these very prestigious vehicles, top of the class, that you can present to the community to drive, and if you think about that, that's something that brings them happiness. But on the other side of that, at a very high level, they also have to deal with the idea of recalls and the fact that something goes majorly wrong with their vehicle. And they have to bring it back from the consumer or from the dealership, or and pay a lot of fines. So something that could actually just destroy the company itself. So as you think about that, you go from being excited about this new technology or this very expensive vehicle that you put out there to being, kind of scared for, okay, so we found an issue, is that a safety issue, security issue? So that's the terror that we see from, at least from that perspective. Now, and I'll dig into one more. Maybe we think about it from the consumer perspective, right? You just went out and bought this $200,000 vehicle and you're showcasing it to everybody. So you're excited. So at a very high level, right? It's like the OEM providing that to you. But on the other side, you have this vehicle that you're driving down the road and maybe you have some unintended acceleration. And that should sound familiar to people because that actually happened in the industry. Or your brakes failed, or someone takes over the vehicle while you're driving it because maybe there's some glitch in the software. So from a consumer perspective, right, they're looking at the problems that might occur with the vehicles, or after they spend all this money and they don't get the excitement out of it. That from basically going from the excitement at a high level to having the fear of their vehicle not operating as they intended to operate. And if you think about it, these things are really driven by topics like what Dan mentioned earlier, right? Hundreds of millions of lines of code that are in these vehicles. So if you're thinking about it, the evolution of the software-defined vehicle, has put us in a place where now you can't really touch and feel the components that help you drive it. Like, gearboxes and drive shafts have been replaced with just wires now. So when those things go wrong, you have problems with those things, right? It could go majorly wrong because now one little problem can create issues in the system. But on the other side of that, the excitement could be, even though you have increasing complexity, the joy side of that is being able to resolve or understand the problems that exist in these complex vehicles. So that's kind of a high level of saying, hey, here's some joys and terrors related to automotive engineering. And then maybe you think about vehicles are now systems of systems, right? So you have multiple levels of system engineering that exists, where you have an industry that's really not that versed in doing system engineering. So if you look at an automobile, you could have over 40 to 100 ECUs or control units in those vehicles that is distributed among 100 different suppliers. So the complexity there is dealing with the system of systems and how they all interact and communicate with each other, not just for timing and different modes. So being able to understand that is some of the things that relate to having the joy and terror and witnessing how those systems really work together. When they work together well, everyone's excited. When you have simple timing issues from systems of systems between different suppliers, right? It creates a situation where there's some issue in the industry. And that can have a domino effect on the entire vehicle. So again, at a very high level, those are some topics that are related to joy and terror in automotive engineering. So Dan, if you have any more you want to add from, based on our discussions, feel free.
I think I've got a couple ones, so thanks. From the manufacturer, the Volkswagens, the Mercedes, the Stellantis, the Fords, who we call the OEMs, the original manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, they're making money. So that's their joy, right? But their terror is that recall, the recall that kills their business. We had an airbag situation a few years ago. That company no longer exists. They were doing great. The company does not exist anymore. That, I believe, is the OEM's biggest terror, is that there's some recall that kills the company. Look at what happened with Volkswagen. and how with the emission gate on how things that impacted us. From the consumer's point of view, the joy is you've got this wonderful piece of technology. You get to drive around it and have the freedom to do what you want to do with it. From me, from the consumer point of view, I think it is did I get a lemon? Is my car safe? Is my car hackable? You know, with more of the cybersecurity issues that are going on now, and the techniques that people are getting, can people take over my car and drive it away? Or can they drive it in such a way that I have no control over? That would scare the crap out of me. And then from the engineering point of view, I think the joy of solving really interesting problems and the continuous learning of the technologies that you have to please. Yeah, we're doing autonomous driving. We're doing machine learning. They're throwing AI inside of cars now. They're being leading edge technologies, or maybe not quite leading edge, but they're taking technologies that were developed many years ago and actually putting them in practice now. So the terrors, I think all of us have been a developer at some point, working those long hours, getting a call in the middle of the night or on a weekend where, you know, a release didn't work and you have to go in and fix it, all the rework. And again, the personal pride of, you know, producing a safe and secure product. I had one story. So many people know me. I did a lot of TSP type of work. I knew how, quote, software should really be developed, because that still is my mantra. I think that's still the best technology that I've ever seen. But the very first time I went to do an assessment at an automotive company, I will tell you, I will not name the manufacturer, and I will not tell you the cars and vehicles that it is in, but I will not rent that car. Any car that has that part in it, because I saw how the sausage was made. So from my personal point of view, that's the terror. I know how the sausage is made and the struggles that are happening with software engineering, not just in automotive, but elsewhere as well. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And actually, Juan, I want to highlight what you just said about that one unintended acceleration in one of our exceptional difference offerings just yesterday. In fact, I quoted some numbers that here is a defect that there were 89 people killed because of that defect between 2000 and 2010. There were over 300 million estimated cars on the road made by that manufacturer. 89 divided by 300 million. It doesn't even register. That's like 0.000 something percent. I mean, it's so low, but such a small thing wreaked complete havoc on the company for years.
That's good. It's an indicate you can never change the branding, right? Once your brand is impacted, it takes a lot longer to fix it.
Absolutely.
Right? And as Dan said, right, that's part of the terror. These, you know, these company killing defects.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. I think we have a bunch more questions I know we want to get through here. The next one, having worked in automotive in 2001, I thought automotive engineering, at least that's when I started, at the time, it was pretty impressive, at least in my humble opinion. Now I'm sure it's even better. How is engineering excellence determined in the automotive industry? And maybe Dan, you lead this one, and then Juan can follow.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So how is engineering excellence determined? So there's different views of this as well. It depends on, so the road user, the consumer that buys these vehicles, different perspective, but is the car safe? Is it reliable? Does it have the sizzle and the features that you want on it? You might consider that excellence, because everything works and it does what it's supposed to do. From the manufacturer's point of view, I think of it is they're happy when they get that sales and profit, right? And they're making their money. Volkswagen has this saying that basically says that their way of ensuring excellence is that the consumer keeps coming back, not the product. You keep coming back to buy the same vehicle over and over again, and we're not getting the returns. Juan mentioned that we have suppliers from tier 1s down to tier Ns, depending upon where you are in the supply chain. But the OEMs keep buying your parts because you do a good job, that they have lack of issues. You know, so they have proven in use. That's their portion of it. But the internal view inside of those companies, how do they do it? Well, every company does it a little bit differently. And they use a variety of different techniques. And we still see, because as consultants, we see this and we try to help people with this particular aspect. But many people are still struggling with this actual process of how do I really determine my excellence. But inside of the industry at the moment, one of the common measurements is adherence to the required standards. So there are multiple standards, both more in the EU, where it's determined by law. Not so much in the US now, but there are sort of de facto standards that most of the manufacturers use. So they have these models and standards that they have to follow. So I mentioned earlier, Automotive SPICE is one. We have one that regards to safety. There is another one that regards to cybersecurity, as well as some manufacturing pieces. And how do they determine that? They do audits, they do assessments that says, hey, it's sort of like the CMMI perspective that we've had in the past. How do I know that you at least have the capability, or supposedly the capability of being able to deliver on time, within budget, with high quality? If you're adhering to these standards and you're actually using those standards appropriately, you should have a better chance of being able to have engineering excellence. But as we've saw from some of our terror stories, that is not always the case. Juan, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll add. So Dan was pretty comprehensive in that, but I'll expand a little on the last part of that, related to the standards. So one of the standards that Dan mentioned was Automotive SPICE, and at the high level, organizations, or let's say OEMs, the customers, are using that as a way of measuring, kind of the maturity in the organizations, and in a way that helps them determine whether they have some type of excellence in development. But in reality, the terror behind that is that the focus is so much on achieving a certain color or a level that we forget about the fact that when we're evaluating with those standards, we're not really checking that the product is performing the way it should. We're checking really that the organization or the teams are performing and behaving the way they should be behaving. So, there's some joy in achieving levels when you're going through these standards, but then there's the idea that, hey, because I achieved that necessary level, that means that my product is good. So I want to separate those two, and that's the joy in being able to say that my organization is performing in the way that I expect them to, and meeting the standards that are there, at least in the samples that I looked at. But if as an example, I'm looking at the requirements during this evaluation, I'm looking to see if they put together a requirement in the structure that they should have, not whether the requirement's really a good requirement and it makes sense for the product. So we have to be careful in having those conversations. So that's really, for me, the joy is in seeing organizations that are doing a good job in being structured and mature in development. But the terror is sometimes that leads to a misconception that they fully understood their development activities. So that's kind of what I would add to that.
Excellent. I like what you said, Juan, about the focus where it has to be on value, not on the process or the credentialing or the level. And that ties to what you said, Dan, that I really like. A huge part of value to me is what you called the sizzle, right? You've got the steak. The car's got to get you from point A to point B. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be safe, all those things. But there's a thing called sizzle. In 2001, when I started automotive, heated seats were only an option on the highest end luxury mobiles. Can you imagine now not having heated seats? Maybe in California, but those of us in Michigan, upstate New York, Not a chance. Heated seats are non-negotiable. But at one point, it was sizzle. So great answers. I love what you said. Let's move on to the next question. So between the two of you, you've conducted over 600 assessments. Now, personally, that makes me question your sanity, but you enjoy doing it, and somebody's got to. God bless you. I'm happy you do. But in that time, what have you learned, and what would you tell new assessors that you wish you knew when you had first started? Maybe Dan, take the lead on this one, and we'll get over to Juan after that.
So how much time do we have?
Not
20
enough.
minutes and 3
No,
questions.
certainly not enough. Okay, so to me, there's a big difference between being a licensed assessor and having assessment experience. So in our industry, to become an assessor, there's a certain set of classes you need to take and some experience that you have to have and pass some tests and pay some money to be licensed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're experienced. So the example that I throw out there is think about, it's germane to this topic, is new drivers, people that are 16 years old. They're licensed to drive, but how much experience do they have? Versus someone that's in their 30s that's been driving for 15 or 16 years, or 40s or 50s. And we won't go into the people that are older than that, because at some point there's a diminishing set of return. Even though they have the experience, they don't have the reaction times, et cetera, to be able to do that. But there's a big difference between being licensed and having the experience to be able to do assessments. And the thing that we've really learned, and we see it all the time, and I have to preface this, is in my 15 years in being side of automotive, I've been a consultant. So I'm helping people do process improvement. I'm helping them do different techniques to be able to create better requirements, better architectures, better software, better testing, as well as doing the assessments. And Dave, the fun part of this job is doing just that, not necessarily doing the assessments. Sometimes they could be like pulling teeth. However, what we've seen over and over and over again is that every assessor is different. Every assessor has a different background. So we've seen assessors that are purely just from academia that have never developed a piece of software or systems in their life. So they know technically, academically what's supposed to happen, but they've never done it. So they don't know the realities. We've seen people that are just managers. They may or may not have technical experience. And then we see people that are also developers. So they know what it's like, and they know where the shortcuts take place, right? And they know what you should be doing versus what you're not supposed to be doing. There's also, as you do that, your understanding and interpretation of what that model is expecting you to do, right? So Juan mentioned, here's a requirement. Well, while we're not supposed to be able to say, is this a good requirement or not? If you've done requirements before, you know what's expected. You know what is a good requirement. You know what the characteristics are. So you have that. You've got that personal experience. You've got domain knowledge. So how can you imagine somebody doing an assessment of project management or program management for a 250-person project where the sun never sets? They're in India. They're on all time zones in the US. They're in China. They're in Indonesia. They're in Mexico. They're in Canada, and they're in Germany. And how do you coordinate and understand how they do project management and how that's supposed to work? So that domain knowledge is really important as well as your experience. Now, I've had the not necessarily so unique opportunity, but I've done a lot of assessments, but I've also been on the other side of the coin where I've been assessed. So I know what the pressures are for both sides. And not every assessor gets that capability, has that piece. Now, what that does is, even though we're looking at the same model and we're having the same hopefully the same interpretation of what that model is, we will find different weaknesses, or we'll miss weaknesses. Or as you do the grading to say, did I pass this particular process? yes or no, we would grade differently. So something that I would look at and say, that's a definite weakness. You're not doing this. How can you even conceivably doing this? And somebody else without the experience might say, oh, that's perfectly okay. So every experience, every assessor is different. Now, I learned that back when I was working with you, Dave, and we were working on CMM and CMMI land when we were trying to decide, we would actually pick our assessors based upon their interpretation of the model. Were you really rigid? Was it the exact literal words of the model? Because we actually see in our example, we have heard tales in the ASPICE model. There's some normative information and there's informative information. So the normative sort of tells, this is what has to be there. But there's pieces where it says, for example, you need to have these 3 different work products. It says, for example, and we know where people have been downgraded and did not pass the assessment because they did not have those 3 work products that were in the, for example. So that's stuff that I really like to have. But the other piece that's really important here is that we know that every assessment is different. So I've done these for a long time, and I learn something every time I do an assessment. Every time. So one, I've had a lot of discussion with a lot of other people is like, what's the perfect assessment? What makes a assessment perfect? And we think of it from different points of view. From the assessment lead, the guy that's leading the team, from the team member that's on the assessment team, from the person that's being interviewed, from the senior management of the organization that's being interviewed or that the project is in, and even from the organization. What's that perfect assessment? So what we've been trying to truly come up with is, what are the characteristics of this perfect assessment? And I really wish that I knew that up front, because that would change how I do my assessment. And it's truthfully how I would change how I would teach the assessment to different people as well. So one of the things that Juan and I have had the great pleasure of being able to do lately is we've actually created a class that talks about, it's a sort of a road to mastery. So earlier we were mentioned that there's a difference between being licensed and having experience. So over the course of all these years, I've seen some really good assessors. I've seen some really poor assessors. Most of us that have had been assessed, we've all experienced that. And so what we've been really trying to do is take that hard fought, hard learned experience, practical based wisdom that we've experienced and learned, and we put this into a class. So we're trying to teach the assessors that take this class, here's all the stuff that you really need to know. So there's gotchas when you do planning. There's gotchas when you do the interviews. There's things that when I'm doing an assessment and I'm looking at project management, I know what I'm supposed to look for. So some organizations, and this was an epiphany that we had, is in a lot of organizations and Automotive SPICE have different assessors, and they were trying to standardize the questions that they were going to ask the people. And the epiphany when this person took the class was, it's not the questions, it's knowing what I should look for. These are the characteristics of a good project plan. These are the characteristics. How do I do estimation and how do I do it well? If we are PSP people, we know you have to do size, right? And you use size to help you determine effort. People don't know that. So what do I know to look for each of these particular practices? And the practices inside of ASPICE go from project management, from quality assurance, configuration management, the normal things that we would call support processes, but it's also very in depth with regards to the technical aspects. So the CMMI has one process area called technical solutions, right? And that covers everything basically from architecture almost through unit testing. Automotive SPICE has multiple process areas, architectures, at the system level, at the software level, at requirements at both of those levels. How do I write detailed designs? How do I do coding? How do I do unit testing? How do I do integration and integration testing? All of those things are spelled out in great detail. So it's really important for us, and I wish that I knew this, and I wish the assessors knew this, is what do you know, what should be there? Now, the other thing is, just like most other assessments, we run into difficult situations. So in other arenas, we come up with the organization that they're doing this process improvement using this model, and they're doing it for the check mark. I want this certificate that says, well, we don't give certificates, but they want something that says, I'm ASPICE level 2 or I'm ASPICE at level 3, because that's what the manufacturer wants. And that's all that they're looking for. They're not looking for the value that takes place inside of this.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with those bad people and those misconceptions. So it's all of this stuff that we've learned over the course of the years that we really want to be able to teach people to so that they can actually add value and have experience. So one of the examples that I see is to become capable of leading an assessment, you have to have passed certain tests, but you have to have 250 hours worth of experience, which is basically like doing 5 assessments. But you could have 5 assessments on the same project with the same exact project team. So that's, to me, 5 times the same experience.
Agreed.
Versus 5 different projects with 5 different leads on 5 different types of, an engine controller, a body controller, electronic braking system, an entertainment system. It's different because you get those particular different situations. So our class is all about trying to teach them, this is what you really need to know, and allow you to work towards mastery, right? An interesting, yep, go ahead. Sorry.
I have to wrap up because I'm getting the cue. We got about 10 minutes left and we still have 2.
Cool.
You wanted to go through. I'd love to give Juan a shot at this question.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave.
All right, Juan.
I don't know if there's much left that Dan didn't cover, but I'll just say that what I tell new assessors is that you don't know what you don't know. Don't be afraid to ask for help. During assessments, I might reach out to Dan during the evening and say, hey, I came across this situation. Because again, every assessment can be different. Every group that you interact with can be different. And it's not enough to just, just go through it once. One of the things that even as Dan and I put this class together, that I picked up is that I need to have a more dedicated set of guidance for what we're doing. So for each of the process areas, I know what I'm looking for. So maybe all the things that I might have missed before, I write them down so I can focus on the activity at hand, right? The things that are all normal that you need to look for, make sure you have guidance on what to do there. So when you come across special occasions, right, you can focus on that. You can use your brain power to work with that. And my example is that my first assessments that I went through, I got pulled in because the lead assessor didn't have any engineering experience. So they needed someone who understood engineering to be able to ask engineering questions. So that to me brought that initial question out as, well, how can you become a lead assessor if you don't know? And that's when I learned that, well, the ASPICE model doesn't care if you are educated in each of the disciplines. They care if you understand the model and can ask questions about the model. So that's what I would also give to any new assessors, that don't be afraid to ask for help. Guidance is going to be necessary, and that every assessment and every assessor is different. And you need to learn and document what you learn from each one of those. Because each product might be different, each assessor might be different. So that's the one thing I would add to what Dan was saying. Otherwise, it's pretty comprehensive, because we talk about this all the time.
Cool. All right. I'm gonna pare it back real quickly though. You've both focused extensively on outcomes, a lot more than process. You talked about focusing on what you're doing, you've talked about the outcomes, and you've talked about the value and the joy that comes from the value, not of the process improvement or not of the appraisal or the assessment, but the outcomes from what those deliver. So I think that's excellent feedback and a good takeaway for us. So the next question, we've got 2 more questions. So we're going to get these in the next 8 to 9 minutes so that Julia can wrap up. We'll probably go a little faster. So we'll call it the lightning round. Juan, you're up. What recommendation would you make to both leaders and engineers tackling improvements in automotive or safety critical engineering?
Well, so if we look at it from the very high level, right, we're asking them to focus on the quality of the product that they're delivering, right? And speed to market is important, and I think organizations are focused on that, but focus on the quality of the product that you're delivering, and be adaptable and committed to delivering that type of product. Because in the end, right, as we said earlier, we want the customer to come back and not the product, because that's going to be the value that we add. But, you know, if we look into more detail, and I'll be quick, right? If I'm a leader, I'm focusing on making sure that I have the right people, that, you know, I keep them continuously, provide them an opportunity to be continuously trained, that we're developing a communication system that allows them to share their knowledge with other engineers at the same level or new engineers as they come in, because that's going to keep me adaptable and keep our organization growing, right? And then, as you know, as a leader, as an engineer, continuous learning part of that. You know, don't just stop where you know, I have my degree, I understand this topic. Always be willing to go out and look. Standards are always changing, the technology is changing, the industry is always growing, right? So grow your skill set. Hopefully that was quick enough.
It was quick and it was perfect. I love it. Dan, anything you want to add?
Focus on quality. They always plan to hit a home run. At every project is going to hit a home run. Everything's going to execute perfectly. And we all know that that's an impossible thing to do. So doing it right the first time and demanding that it's being done right the first time is the thing that they really need to focus on. And do not accept anything less than that. That's a quick point on that.
Excellent. Focus on quality, continuous learning. And Juan, I actually love this quote. I wrote it down. I'm going to keep it and use it. You want the customer to come back, not the product. Nice. Okay, last question for the 2 of you. You've both demonstrated just a little passion on what you do. You obviously love what you do. You love engineering. You love the improvements. Why do you love it, and why do you keep working on making it better? Juan, why don't you go first?
Because every day is different. You know, every engagement is different. So I'm an engineer by trade, right? I went to school to become an engineer. And for me, each engagement that I have is a challenge to learn, as an opportunity to learn, and a challenge to exercise my ability to adapt to the new situation. As we talked about earlier, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but I was a consultant also. So now I'm more in a teaching mode. But, you know, in doing consulting, every time I went into a new customer site, the challenges were similar, but different. So it was up to me to come up with a new way of addressing or attacking them. And to me, it wasn't like going to work at that, right? This made each and every day exciting. So that's why I love it, because I see something different every time I do an engagement, and I have an opportunity to grow with each one. And also, you know, being in front of the customer and being able to collaborate with them and share the challenges, you know, just makes me that much better for the next project that I go to as well. So short, sweet. Dan?
Ooh, tough act to follow, Juan. Technology is going to continue to take a bigger and bigger portion of our lives. If we look at our grandparents we look at our parents, and we look at us and where we were when we first, most of us on this call, when we first started, the internet did not exist. Now it does. Machine learning wasn't thought of. AI was just science fiction. It's the continuing growth and knowledge and the application of that knowledge is why I love the engineering aspect of this. The reason I keep making it better is is sort of self-evident from that answer is it's only going to become more prevalent, and we can make it better. And for years, that's really been my thought of how can we do this better? How can we do this faster? How can we bring more value to the organization and to ourselves, actually, every time that we go out? That's been a passion for me, I think, since I started doing this stuff, Dave, way back before I knew you, like 35 or 36 years ago.
Sounds good.
6 years ago.
So,
I'm talking in hex.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, of course, it's binary. Great answers. I remember back in 2001, they said that someday the car would actually be a computer on wheels. It happened. They said someday cars would have artificial intelligence to learn how to drive themselves. They have. Change is here to stay in every industry. And I think what you've just demonstrated is that it's happening in automotive at an astronomical rate, probably faster than a lot of other industries, in fact. And the only way to keep up, I just heard multiple times from Juan, is a commitment to lifelong learning, always trying to learn, grow, improve your skill set. I heard you both say repeatedly, stay close to the customer, get closer, understand what you're doing by knowing the customer. And I'll paraphrase what you both said multiple times, focus on value. And we all know that value can't exist without quality. So I think that's kind of a call to action for everyone in this room that, our jobs are going to get more challenging and more relevant as there's a higher technical presence in probably everything we do across all industries. Now, I did see one question pop up in the chat. I'd love to give it a minute before giving it back to Julia. And the question is, what is the biggest deficit that you see most commonly across the organizations you assess? So maybe this time Dan and then Juan.
So interestingly, and this has been in place for many, many, many years for you that remember the Standish chaos reports, et cetera, most projects in automotive do not fail because of technical issues. Most projects fail because of project management. That's the biggest deficit. That's the hardest one that everybody tackles, is good project management.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Juan?
Well, Dan.
Sorry, Juan.
I agree, right? However, I look at it from the other side. I think communication, which manifests itself in the inability to build good requirements and communicate good requirements. So the system does not built the way it should be built the first time, at least. And that forces you to have so many different iterations. I'll quickly say that a lot of organizations now see the topic of safety requirements, security requirements, and just something called normal requirements as all being different topics, right? But that's not what they are. They're all just requirements. So I say communication and being able to share that past information from the top throughout the rest of the system, in addition to project management.
And I can support you on that one.
All right.
But we'll have to have a conversation over a beer or two on that.
Yeah, well, we know where that's going.
I'll join you for that one.
All right.
But I do think what we just heard is the whole ecosystem of system engineering. Everything is a system of systems. And we heard that at the beginning. I know Jeff and I talk about that often in Never. System of systems. Everything is a combination of software, hardware, different forms of technology. And what you just said is it's all built on good requirements, being able to articulate, communicate, have a good plan, execute the plan, design for quality, build for quality, and deliver value to the customer.